Hi there guys, this is a video for paper 2 question 2 for GCSE English Language with AQA. This question is sometimes known as the summary question. It can also be known as a comparison question. The technical name on the specification is the synthesis question, which is a technical word which means to compare two things together or more than two things together in order to ascertain similarities and differences. So this can also be called the similarities and differences question. But whatever you call this question, there are certain things about it which will always remain the same. We always answer it in the same way. It always requires the same from you, no matter what you call it. So the aims of this session are to remind you what this task requires from you. You might have already done some work on this question and you want to revise it, which is why you're watching this video. I'm then going to look at two extracts, both of which are about snow. One of those extracts is the modern extract, and the other is the 19th century one, because obviously this is paper 2. There's always going to be two extracts, one of which is the older extract. And then we're going to use those two extracts to practice how to prepare and plan them, and how to structure the response, how to, I suppose, highlight the evidence in the extracts. And then this video is going to finish by me showing you two model answers. One of them is more successful than the other. So that is the direction of this session. So let's start then by talking about what we know about this question. So even before we look at any specific extract which has a specific theme in mind, because these papers tend to be very thematic, they're based on some kind of theme. What do we know about this question? So we know that it's 8 marks, which means that you should spend about 10 minutes on it. And students are often told to write a maximum of 2 paragraphs. What I want to make clear, though, is that it's always better to have quality rather than quantity. So it doesn't really matter if you just manage to write 1 paragraph, as long as what you write is answering the question and meeting the requirements of this questions mark scheme, which we'll talk about later. Really important that for this task you read the question first in order to save time. Some students will read the extracts first, then read the question, and then find they have to read the extracts again, because only then do they know what they're being asked to look for. So an exam strategy would be to read the question first, and that's, I suppose, the case for all questions in this course. Have a highlighter in hand when you read those extracts so you can quickly find the evidence that you need, and it's not a case of colouring in the whole paragraph. There will be very specific bits of evidence that are quite short that you can use, but also to read the whole of the source, because the answers will be somewhere in the sources. So it's really important that you read the whole extract. When I teach this question, I always say to students about CEI, which is really my way of saying easily to them about the 3 skills really that they need to demonstrate when they're answering this question. Because this is a comparison question, and that is either similarities or differences, it's always a good idea for students to use connectives like however, similarly, and so on, because that shows a very clever and very confident way of synthesizing information. The E stands for evidence. It shouldn't come as a surprise to you now with an English paper that you need to quote evidence from the extracts as your quotes. And finally, inference, and this is probably the trickiest bit, because this is the bit really that you need to be able to do in enough detail in order to climb the marks. Again, I'm kind of partly assuming that you already have done work on inference, so I'm not starting from scratch with this. But basically, inference is the conclusions and the interpretations that you make about something on your own. So the writer will only tell us so much, and therefore we do this all the time in real life. It's not just in English, but we do it all the time. We make judgments and conclusions all the time about things that we see. So, for example, if you were walking down the high street and you saw an ambulance rushing somewhere with the blue lights on and making the noise, the siren, you would probably assume, you would make the inference that there was an accident somewhere and somebody needed emergency care. You don't have to see the evidence for that. You don't have to see the accident to know that's what it means. If you saw a fire engine down the street, you would know that there's a fire somewhere. You don't have to see the fire to know that. It's a logical conclusion that we make. If you have a character in an extract that is covered in head to toe in tattoos, a logical inference would be they must like tattoos. Alternatively, if a character walked into a room holding an umbrella and they were soaked, their coat was wet, a logical inference would be it would be raining outside. So we are constantly making inferences all the time based on our own life experience. So in this response, words like suggests, implies, infers are very useful words to use because they prompt you to give some kind of inference, some kind of interpretation that you have made on your own. And the more detailed you can do that, the more marks you will get. The way not to get marks in this question is make very simple conclusions. You have to kind of develop them in a confident way. So that's what we know about this question. Okay, so the question itself that we're going to be looking at is this. It will remind you obviously to look at both sources because you have to compare them. And it says the effects of the weather on people in both sources are very different. Use details from both sources to write a summary of the different ways people are affected by the weather. And I've highlighted that in blue because that is the crux of this task. That is the focus of this task. You are looking at both of these sources and snow in both of them in two different settings. And you are saying to the examiner the impact of the snow in source A is different to the impact on people of the snow in source B. And that is what is driving this question. So one of the ways that I start to prompt a response from students is I will show them images. And you can see here that we have an image there of like a mountain range with some hikers on it, which is very similar to the situation in source A. There's a group of climbers on Everest and it's very snowy and dangerous in a blizzard. But in source B, the Victorian extract, is about London and about snow falling in London. And as you can see in that image, the snow isn't that thick. You can still see the road through the tyre marks, for example. But it is snow all the same. And even in this country, in the UK, a small amount of snow can bring about a change. Unfortunately, in this country, when we have a little bit of snow in the UK, things can often quickly grind to a halt. We're not very good at dealing with it, like other countries that have snow more often. So this is all about snow and comparing the impact that those snowy conditions have on the people that are experiencing them in each source. Another way to prompt a response is to ask yourself these two questions. So firstly, how was the weather presented in each source? So that is your inference. The answer to that question is the inference. And the second question is your evidence. How do we know this? So what are the quotes that tell us this? So next slide, I'm going to show you the specific parts of the extract that I've chosen because I haven't screenshotted the whole thing. I've just gone straight into the bits where the answers are to save time, really. And then we're going to start to answer these questions in order to develop our knowledge of this question. So these are the two extracts, and specifically the parts of the extract where the answers can be found. What you will find with this question is that not all of the extract will be relevant. The question tends to be a very specific one. It will have a very specific focus, which means that the answers could all be hidden in one paragraph, and that paragraph might be at the end. So you will get to the end and panic and think, oh my God, I haven't even found any answers yet. But that might be because the answers are always in the last bit. So you have to have quite an eagle-eyed approach to this task. Not all of it will be relevant. So that's the reason why I've cut down these extracts. So I'm going to read out each source, and then we're going to highlight which quotes, I suppose, which sentences will form good evidence to put in your response to start your inference, I suppose, to prompt your inference. So source A, the writer says there in the death zone, more than 30 climbers were fighting for their lives. On the northern side, 3 Indian climbers were stranded, exhausted, and with their oxygen supplies running out. High on the northeast ridge. On the southern side, 2 commercial expeditions were strung out between the South Col and the summit. The night that faced them was a night from hell. By the end of the following day, the 3 Indian climbers on the north side and 5 of the climbers on the south were dead. The total of 8 fatalities made this the greatest loss of life in any 24-hour period on the peak. So all your answers really can be found in that section. You've got enough there to work with for the 8 marks. Remember, you've got to ask yourself, what impact does the weather have on people? Okay, and we need to apply that same question to source B. This is the Victorian one. Okay, and it says people were in thick coats and wrappers, and they stepped noiselessly along. The Strand was as quiet and empty as a village street at nightfall. Even the foot passengers were far fewer than usual. Here, in the heart of London, and at midday, there was absolute cleanliness and brightness, absolute silence. Instead of the roar and rush of wheels, the selfish hurry, the dirt, and the cloudy fog, we had the loveliness and utter purity of new fallen snow. It fell without force or sound, and all things huge and hasty and noisy were paralysed in a moment. I walked along enjoying the wondrous lovely scene, the long perspective of houses, all grown picturesque and antique. Their gable roofs were white against a clear sky, and every overhanging joint and beam in their outline picked out in brilliant white. And beneath them the tumbled and peopleless pavement of snow. It was like the quaint still London of old. One might have been arm in arm with Mr. Pepys or even Mr. W. Shakespeare. And this state of things lasted all day. And then towards the end of the extract, there's reference to a woman called Caroline Randall, by trade an ironer, who had no home, who slept last night on the step in a sheltered corner, and felt as cold as a frog, she said. So again, there are answers in that section for this response. What impact does the weather have on the snow? And as you can tell from the tone in each of these extracts, there is a completely different, I suppose, relationship between the people and the snowy conditions. We've got to bear that in mind when we start to compare these extracts. So you can pause this video now to highlight if you've got the extracts in front of you or jot down some answers, or you can continue watching this video and we'll go through some of the possible quotes you could use. So in blue here, I have highlighted very, I suppose, selectively all the bits of information which would be useful in, or could be useful in answering this task. So it says in source A, 30 climbers were fighting for their lives. Oxygen supplies running out, there were stranded climbers, and it says that 8 climbers died because of the weather. So clearly the weather here is very savage, it's very dangerous, and it's very severe. It can be the difference between life and death. However, so using that connective of contrast, however, the relationship between the snow and the people in source B is very, very different. The impact on their behaviour is very, very different. It's not as severe. So rather than having these very complex oxygen supplies and the kind of equipment that you need on a mountainous area to survive, instead the public in London were just wearing thick coats and wrappers. So I presume that's a scarf-like thing, which we all have, don't we? We all have scarves and coats. It's how we manage to deal with the winter here in the UK. We don't have weather which we would expect on Everest in the UK. So it's a very trivial way of keeping warm. The writer is clearly very poetic about the snow. He calls it a wondrous, lovely scene. He calls it very pure, lovely, absolute cleanliness and brightness. So you can tell that the writer himself doesn't see the snow as anything dangerous. He sees it actually as very beautiful and something to be almost celebrated and cherished because of the change it brings about in people's behaviour in the city. Towards the end of the extract there on line 35, Caroline Randall, who is asked for her views, I suppose, of the weather, says that she's as cold as a frog. We've got that simile there. She calls herself as cold as a frog. But that's, more trivial than dying because of the cold weather. It's as if, she can deal with the cold. It's not perfect, but she can deal with it. It's not as severe as the cold or the extreme conditions perhaps in source A. We're also told in source B that the writer's beard froze, and I think we're also told from memory that he has a headache as well. So obviously much more trivial impacts of the weather on the writer and the people he talks to. So there's a difference here in the impact that the snow has on people's behaviour. So we can now answer those two questions. The red here is our inference, and the black is the quotes. And both of those need to be in our response in order to get a decent mark. And what I mean by that is more than half marks. Remember, in order to get the grade 4, you need to consistently get around half marks for each question. Okay. If you're wanting a grade 7, 8, or 9, obviously you need to aim more for full marks for each question. So I'm not going to read through that. You can see that basically the weather in source A is much more dangerous than the weather in source B. The setting is also different. So you've got a city centre or a city setting where there's going to be more people, perhaps. So if you do get into trouble, it's easier to get help. Source A, though, is a wilderness. It's out in a deserted place where not many people survive or live and so on. So if you get into trouble, you really have to rely on yourself. So the setting is different too. And I wouldn't suggest that you have to use all of those quotes. I've just collected, perhaps they're a good selection of the different things you could use. So what I do now with my students is I will give them a template, and that template you can stick to with any question, with any extracts really. I will give them an introductory sentence. So for this response, it would be something like, whereas the wintry conditions are presented in both extracts, the severity of the snow is different in each source and its impact on people. So that's your little introduction, one sentence. You don't have time to write anything more as an introductory paragraph there. That does the job. It also shows the examiner that you are comparing straight away. And then I will say, okay, start by looking at source A, quote, then inference, and then use however or in contrast if it's a difference, and then look at source B. And that will be your full response. I went to some training a couple of years ago now, and there are lots of different ways that you can answer this question. So you might be taught slightly differently than this. Each school, each college each teacher tends to have their own way of getting students to answer this question. So by giving you this template, I'm not suggesting they're wrong, but this is just the way that I teach my students in this kind of clear-cut way. They're still comparing. So the last part of this video is I'm just going to show you two examples, two model answers. This one, which is somewhere between grades 1 to 3, so you're looking at maybe 1 to 3 marks out of 8 for this, level 1, level 2, as you can see there on the mark scheme. So either limited or simple or some attempt. You can see the mark scheme has 3 bullet points to it for this question. It's in terms of inference, it's about quotes, and it's about differences. So the connective can help with that. So if you're wanting to get, let's say, 3 marks out of 8, then you would be writing something like this. So this is the complete response. The weather is different in each source. In source A, when the storm arrives, it traps 30 climbers in the death zone, and after a night from Hal, 8 of them die. This is different to source B because no one is killed because of the weather. The snow makes the writer's beard freeze and everyone has to put warm clothes on, but that's it. In source A, the weather has a dangerous effect on the people, but in source B, it is not really a problem and is pretty instead of deadly. So that's accurate, but it's not very detailed in terms of the inference. You can see, for example, on line 4, where they quote a night from Hal, 8 of them die. That's quite an important part of this extract. The student here could have expanded a bit more on that in terms of what does it mean about the weather then, that it's severe enough to kill people. So there were moments in this response where the inference could have been developed a little bit more. Okay, so if you were going to write a response like this in 10 minutes, you're looking at maybe getting 3 out of 8, which is consistent overall maybe with a grade 3. So that is that kind of standard. If you want to get a GCSE grade 4 or above, then you're going to need to write in a little bit more detail. So this answer would fit somewhere between let's say 4 to 8 marks. So level 3, level 4, perceptive or clear. And as you can see, the bullet points remain the same. So you can see it's longer, first of all, which suggests that they've gone into more detail. Whereas wintry weather conditions are presented in both extracts, the severity of the snow is different in each source and its impact on people. In source A, the writer says that the severe snowstorm led to a total of 8 fatalities, and at one point more than 30 climbers were left fighting for their lives because of dwindling oxygen supplies. If people don't have enough oxygen, then they can die, suggesting that the dangerous weather presented in this extract can have a fatal consequence if climbers are unprepared. In contrast, the snow in London in source B is seen as beautiful and creates a wondrous, lovely scene where people only have to put on warm coats to keep out the cold. This is different to source A, where climbers have to invest in professional camping equipment. A girl feels as cold as a frog, and the writer's beard froze, which are much more trivial impacts of the weather on people. The fact that source B is set in an urban setting, where there are more people compared to source A, which is set in a wilderness, also makes the consequences of the snow in source B seem less severe, bearable, and enjoyable to witness. Okay, so that would sit somewhere between grades 4 to 9, okay, from the 9 to 1 specification. They haven't mentioned the girl who was as cold as a frog. There is, sorry, it is mentioned. So it is in there. So yeah, a little bit more detailed. There's a in contrast connective in there, so they're clearly comparing. The quotes are quite well chosen. And there's also a much more pleasing level of inference as well. So they've gone into a little bit more detail too. So that would get you somewhere between levels 3 or 4, perhaps between 4 or 5 marks to 8 marks, so towards the top end of the mark scheme. So in summary then, for this question, it's all about being able to interpret your quotes. What does it mean? Why have you quoted this? How do you interpret that quote in relation to the question? Making sure that you read the question before the extracts, and you also make sure that you compare as well, and use some connectives to show that you are comparing and synthesizing that information. Thank you.